Women's suffrage. By 1890, women had partial suffrage in 19 states. The National American Women's Suffrage Association had grown from 13,000 in 1893 to 75,000 in 1910, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. She was the most effective leader in a new generation of women's suffrage proponents. She de-emphasized the argument that women deserved the vote as a matter of right because they were in all respects equal to men, and instead stressed the desirability of suffrage so that women could continue to discharge their traditional duties as homemakers and mothers in an increasingly public world of the city. The winning plan emphasized lobbying Congress, effective meetings and parades. They publicized women's contributions to the war effort, which President Wilson would use to urge Congress to approve suffrage. With prohibition imminent as a result of World War I, the liquor lobby eased its opposition to female suffrage. Alice Paul's Congressional Union used militant tactics to gain attention, such as picketing the White House in 1916 and going on hunger strikes. She led the most militant women out of NASA to form the Congressional Union and put forth an Equal Rights Amendment after 1920. The 19th Amendment would be passed in 1920, granting women full suffrage. Despite all of the reforms proposed during the Progressive Era, African Americans made few gains during the time period. Teddy Roosevelt was lambasted by critics for allowing Booker T. Washington to dine in the White House. He would never again publicly support African Americans. The Great Migration, or the northward movement of African Americans during the early 1900s, resulted in violence and race riots. By 1920, 2 million African Americans lived in the North, out of roughly 11 million in the country. The race riots were due largely to the large migrations of African Americans out of the South and into the predominantly white northern cities, especially during and after World War I. Large numbers of lynchings continued between 1890 and 1920. W.E.B. Du Bois demanded immediate social and economic equality for African Americans. He called Washington an Uncle Tom for condemning blacks to manual labor and perpetual inferiority. His opposition to Washington, as well as to other African American leaders, led to the formation of the Niagara Movement between 1905 and 1909. They demanded immediate end to segregation and to discrimination in the unions, courts, and public accommodations. They demanded equality of economic and educational opportunity. Du Bois demanded that the talented tenth of the black community be given full and immediate access to mainstream of American life. The NAACP was formed using many of the Niagara Movement's principles. The activism of Washington, Du Bois, and others led to some advances for African Americans. For example, black illiteracy rates were cut in half between 1900 and 1910. Black ownership of land increased by 10%. President Wilson and African Americans. Wilson had white supremacist tendencies. His 2-volume History of the United States is now notorious for its racist views of Reconstruction. Wilson greatly admired D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, an early film that was ripe with racism. Congress would not pass several pieces of legislation that Wilson proposed to limit the civil rights of African Americans. Wilson presided over an accelerated segregation in the federal bureaucracy, and African Americans were effectively left out of the Democratic Party until the 1930s. Wilson's foreign policy, excluding World War I. Wilson hated imperialism and thus recoiled initially from an aggressive foreign policy. He was repelled by the big stick policy and dollar diplomacy. Yet, Wilson would eventually intervene in Latin America more than any other president in U.S. history. His anti-imperialist policies, within 1 week in office, Wilson proclaimed that the government would no longer offer special support to American investors in Latin America and China. He repealed the Panama Canal Tolls Act, which had exempted U.S. shipping from tolls, thus provoking protests from Great Britain. The Jones Act in 1916, which was supported by Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, granted the Philippines territorial status and promised independence as soon as a stable government could be established. 30 years later, on July 4th, 1946, the Philippines received their independence. The Jones Act of 1917 gave Puerto Ricans the status of citizens. Crisis with Japan. The California legislature had prohibited Japanese Americans from owning land. Japan protested vigorously. The U.S. Navy feared Japan might attack the Philippines. Secretary of State Bryan went to California and pleaded with the state legislature to soften its stance, and thus tensions were eased somewhat. Despite Wilson's anti-imperialism stance, Wilson would keep the Marines in Nicaragua to maintain order after they had landed in 1912, and an American financial expert had taken over control of customs. U.S. forces were also sent to Haiti in 1914 and 15, when the Haitian president was torn to pieces. In 1916, U.S. Marines were sent to the Dominican Republic when riots and civil war broke out. In 1917, the U.S. purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark. Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, which begins in 1910. Porfirio Diaz had become a dictator since 1876, but now opposed by the native masses and frustrated middle class. Francisco Madero, a revolutionary, replaced Diaz as the president of Mexico in 1911. Foreign investors feared that Madero would yield to the radicals, who vowed to confiscate property owned by foreigners. So foreign diplomats, including the U.S., and business people, plotted with discontented elements of the Mexican army to replace Madero with General Huerta. In reality, Madero was moderate and preferred by Wilson. Poor Mexicans waged a revolution, and in February 1913, overthrew Madero. General Huerta, a full-blooded Indian, installed as president. Massive migration of Mexicans to the U.S. ensued. The American interest in Mexico cried for U.S. intervention and protection. Wilson initially stood firm against intervention. Though he did not recognize Huerta, later Wilson massed U.S. troops on the border and sent warships to Mexico, warning Huerta that unless he abdicated or left his position, the U.S. would overthrow him. Wilson saw Huerta as a brute. "I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men," he said. In 1914, he allowed the U.S. arms to flow to Carranza and Francisco Pancho Villa, who were Huerta's principal rivals. The Tampico Incident. In April of 1914, a small party of U.S. sailors was arrested at an Atlantic seaport of Tampico for being in a war zone without a permit. Wilson ordered the Navy to seize Veracruz. Congress and much of the American public were outraged. Both Huerta and Carranza were condemned. 126 Mexican casualties and 19 American casualties resulted. Americans occupied and modernized the city for 7 months. The ABC powers, or Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, offered to mediate just as full-scale war seemed inevitable at the Niagara Falls Conference. Meanwhile, Pancho Villa emerged as Carranza's chief rival. Carranza was reluctantly supported by the U.S. with arms and diplomatic recognition. Villa retaliated by killing 18 Americans at Santa Isabel, Mexico in January 1916. In March of 1916, Villa's army shot up Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17 Americans. As a result, General John J. Pershing was ordered to subdue Villa. He penetrated 300 miles into the Mexican state of Chihuahua with 5,800 in U.S. forces, where they clashed with Carranza's forces and mauled Villa's forces. Villa was never captured by the U.S., but was ultimately assassinated in 1923. The U.S. left Mexico. Wilson's intervention into Mexico was seen as outrageous on both sides in Mexico's civil war, and the U.S. needed to get out. With the threat of war with Germany becoming real, the U.S. withdrew its invading army on February 5, 1917. Wilson's foreign policy was so unpopular that it was flatly repudiated in the 1920s. The election of 1916. The Republicans and the Bull Moose Progressives met in Chicago. The Progressives renominated Teddy Roosevelt, but he had no desire to once again split the Republican vote, as he hated Wilson. So the Republican Old Guard nominated Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes, the ex-governor of New York, who had achieved solid liberal reforms. Wilson was nominated at the Democratic Convention in St. Louis. His campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," though his slogan should have been, "He kept us out of war, but not for long." The Democratic orators warned that electing Hughes meant getting involved in World War I. The results of the election, Wilson defeats Hughes 277 to 254. Midwesterners and Westerners voted overwhelmingly for Wilson based on his progressive reforms and anti-war policies. Voters who hoped Wilson would keep them out of war were soon to be disappointed.